Hi, thanks for joining us. In your paper, you mentioned that early sort of conventional wisdom on internet governance is differed from what has actually happened in the last 10 years. Could you give us a brief overview of that?
Sure. Basically, initially, people thought the internet was so new, so radical, so different that it required an entirely different type of governance. Governance exclusively at the global level, really detached from states. There was the notion that states probably didn't have a lot of enforcement powers. They wouldn't have jurisdiction over cyberspace, so that entirely new architecture of governance was necessary. What we've seen instead is slowly but steadily states and governments have actually caught up with the internet and with the technology. In part, that is because the internet has become the victim of its own success. It has penetrated all aspects of society, of the economy, and so it's become impossible to separate online from offline or cyberspace from real space. And so governments have actually asserted authority over the internet. They haven't been perfect, but they've been a lot more effective than people expected, I think, early on.
But at the same time, national regulatory differences have made it difficult to form sort of a homogeneous sort of internet governance framework.
That's correct. I mean, basically, the reach of the networks underlying these new digital markets is global, and so by definition, rules clash in cyberspace. They're extraterritorial very often, so there are lots of conflict, and our argument in the paper is actually that much of internet governance has not been about coming up with entirely new structures, but more resolving regulatory conflicts between different jurisdictions.
And what are current theoretical and sort of analytical frameworks that are used to sort of study internet governance?
Well, so on the one hand side, there's still some literature that looks at internet governance as a completely separate phenomenon. There's still some people out there doing that. But I think more and more people are looking at really, the role of states in that. There's a recent book by Jack Goldsmith and Timothy Wu, Who Rules the Internet, I think is the title. And they really forcefully made the argument that the states are back and they're quite powerful. Having said that, the mechanisms by which states assert themselves in cyberspace are not well understood in the existing literature. People tend to simply equate market size with market power, and we don't actually think that is terribly convincing.
What would you say are some of the most important questions then in this whole internet governance debate?
Right. So the question is, if this is really about different domestic regulatory agendas clashing in cyberspace, a critical question becomes, who wins, who loses, why, who has influence, what are determinants of influence? That's sort of the set of issues that we're working on. And our particular take is that domestic institutions are critical in this, and so the question becomes, what type of domestic institutions, what determines the power of domestic regulators in actually exporting domestic regulation, in projecting regulatory influence globally.
And what would be the best way to then research these, according to you?
Well, of course, our take is somewhat biased by our trajectory, but we really apply, if you want to put a label on it, a historical institutionalist framework on this. So we look at, we're discarding the notion that the internet was sort of, ground zero and everything started with that. We're actually saying, let's look back at legacy policies, at legacy institutions, how domestic institutions have evolved, because they're really the foundation for states projecting influence in this environment. So you really ought to take a historical approach, even go back before the internet. Take the example of data privacy, for example, which was a huge issue in the late 1990s and still is. Well, our argument is this wasn't so much about what to do about personal information on the internet. This was about what to do about personal information, and then the internet just, changed the debate and hypercharged it. But what we really see is policies that have been developed in the European Union since the 1970s, really, then being adapted for the internet age. And so I think it's hard to understand contemporary internet governance debates if you don't have that historical perspective and look at where the policies come from, where the preferences come from, what institutional resources states have at their disposal. All of those are very much historically rooted.
And in terms of the nature of the medium itself, does that play a role in then deciding historical policy and how it gets adapted in the current age?
It does. I mean, I don't want to say that this is all business as usual. I mean, the fact that the underlying networks are global means that extraterritorial rules become the norm. Regulatory clashes become the norm. When you regulate territory, it's much easier to say, okay, this is our jurisdiction, this is yours. I mean, you have in the internet constant jurisdictional and regulatory clashes. Enforcement is anything but perfect. I mean, you know, there's this famous quote that the internet interprets censorship as what was it, as an error in the network and routes around it. I think Dan Gilmore said, no, what was his name? Anyway, you know, said this early on in the mid-1990s. So enforcement is not perfect, but let's not kid ourselves. Enforcement is not perfect in the offline world either. We do have regulatory clashes in financial markets, for example, in when it comes to trade policy and trade policy sometimes having extraterritorial effects. So perhaps the challenge is more severe, enforcement is weaker, clashes are more frequent, so the internet does make a difference there. But our argument is that the underlying politics of internet governance aren't all that different from other areas of global governance.
Then why is it so difficult then to come to some sort of international understanding on internet governance?
From a research point of view or from a policy point of view?
From a policy point of view.
Well, because I think nations differ considerably on many of these key questions. I mean, what digital technologies more generally do is they open many questions that we had considered closed for a long time, right? What is the appropriate balance between private and public? What is the extent of free speech, for example? What kind of personal information should be knowable about somebody? Who controls critical resources? And these were questions where countries had different positions for a long time, and those different positions coexisted, quite easily, basically. And here's a medium that basically takes all of this and gives actors global reach, regulation that then tries to follow those actors, also global reach. And all of a sudden, you have free speech policies in one country fundamentally clashing with those in another. Privacy regulation in one fundamentally clashing with those in another. And it's hard enough for a single society to come to terms about how those balances should be struck in this digital age. But to reach global consensus about this is so much more difficult, which is why we've seen so little actual sort of new binding, harmonized global rules about these issues.
Fast forwarding, say, 10 years or 15 years into the future, where do you see internet governance going? Do you see a global consensus ever being reached? Do you see sort of domestic fragmentation? There's consensus on there's very little consensus even on key issues. I mean, I think, issues really about the infrastructure. I mean, there's sort of there will be some more broad consensus about issues such as domain name governance, the role of ICANN, a couple of other things in terms of technical standards and protocols. There'll always be some countries who won't be happy with the status quo, but sort of a large majority of countries perhaps in favor of one thing or another. But I think in many other issues, no. We'll have a patchwork of different rules, just as we have in other areas of global governance. Thinly institutionalized. There'll be regulatory conflicts. Businesses will have to deal with them. Enforcement will not be perfect. But let's face it. I mean, that's what we've had for the past 10 years, and the internet has flourished. Business has just really taken it in, and companies are using it every day. They're dealing with these multi-jurisdictional issues. Citizens are using it. So it hasn't really, threatened the internet's development. So I actually don't think that not having global harmony and global consensus is that detrimental to the internet itself. You mentioned in your paper that the winners and losers are very, very, very simply, on the one hand, the developed world, developed countries, America and the EU, and then the developing world on the other hand. Do you see that as a trend continuing forward? Or?
I do, and I don't like it. But I think, again, we think that internet governance politics are a lot more similar to other areas of international relations and global governance, and people have appreciated it in the past. And if you look at other big issues, if you look at who sets international trade rules, for example, well, the people sometimes sort of jokingly or half-jokingly say, well, if the U.S. and the EU agree, something happens. If they don't agree, nothing happens. And that's pretty much true. I mean, of course, developing countries have been more vocal in recent years over trade policy, the issue of American and European agricultural subsidies and what they do to industries in developing countries that could be competitive in world markets. There's been some slight revision of intellectual property standards, some more transition times for developing countries as part of the Doha round. This has been discussed, but fundamentally, for better or for worse, in terms of global equality, for worse, Europe and the United States is setting the international trade policy agenda. And the same is true probably in international financial markets and financial market regulations. So in that respect, we don't really see internet governance of being that different. Now, having said that, the internet can have tremendous positive impact on developing countries in terms of, helping them leapfrog or accelerate their development, building human capital, a skilled knowledge base, and so on. And I think that's going to have repercussions more generally about sort of global balance of power, and developing countries might have more of a voice as a result of that. But for the time being, unfortunately, this is a field of policy like many others that is run by the most powerful blocs, and those happen to be sort of northern, western, principally the U.S. and the European Union.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.